The silence stretched just long enough to feel deliberate, as if the entire courtroom had been placed on hold by something no one could quite name, and Daniel Mercer let that silence sit before he spoke again, his voice steady but quiet, the kind of quiet that made people lean forward without realizing it. "I was where I was needed," he said, simple and unadorned, and for a brief second it sounded like nothing, like an old man avoiding a direct answer, and a faint scoff came from somewhere in the gallery, quickly swallowed by the weight in the air, because there was something in the way he said it, something that did not ask for belief or approval, something that simply existed, and Judge Whitmore's expression tightened, not in anger, but in irritation, the kind that came from losing control of a narrative he had already decided. "That is not an answer," the judge replied, sharper now, leaning forward again as the overhead lights cast a hard edge across his face. "This court deals in facts, Mr. Mercer, not vague statements and stories that cannot be verified." And he tapped the file in front of him, a thin stack of paper that looked too small to contain an entire life. "Right here, it says there is no record of your involvement in any official operation, no unit assignment that can be confirmed, no commendations, no citations, nothing that supports the claim you are trying to make." And he paused, letting the words settle like a final nail. "So I will ask you one last time, plainly, for the record, were you ever part of a recognized United States military unit?" And the question hung there, heavy and pointed, designed to corner, to force a yes or no that could be easily dismissed, and Daniel did not answer right away. Instead, his thumb brushed against the object in his pocket again, slow, deliberate, and this time Jason Reed noticed it clearly, the slight shift in fabric, the subtle grounding gesture, and something in his chest tightened without explanation. Because he had seen that kind of movement before, not here, not in a courtroom, but in training footage, in briefings, in moments when people carried something they could not show, and Daniel's eyes moved. Just slightly, not scanning the room, not searching, just acknowledging it, as if he knew exactly where everyone stood without needing to look. And when he finally spoke again, his voice dropped just a fraction lower, not weaker, but more focused, like a signal narrowing to a single point. "Some units do not file paperwork the way you are expecting," he said, and there was no challenge in it, no defiance. Just a statement that felt out of place in a room built on documentation, and a ripple of quiet confusion passed through the spectators, because it sounded almost like an excuse, but it did not feel like one, and Judge Whitmore's lips pressed into a thin line. "That sounds convenient," he replied, a hint of sarcasm slipping through now. "Invisible service, undocumented assignments, no chain of command anyone can verify." And he leaned back slightly, confidence returning to his posture. "You understand how that appears to this court." And Daniel gave the smallest nod, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, as if he had expected nothing else. And for a moment the room felt like it was balancing on something fragile, something just beneath the surface. And then the judge exhaled slowly and said, "Then perhaps you can provide something more concrete, something real," his voice lowering again, almost conversational but carrying across every seat. "A designation, a unit identifier, anything that can be checked." And the words landed exactly where they were meant to. An invitation that was not really an invitation at all, but a final test. And Jason Reed's fingers hovered above his keyboard, unmoving now, his screen glowing softly in front of him, waiting, because something told him that whatever came next was not going to fit into the system the way it was supposed to. And Daniel Mercer's hand stilled against his pocket, his shoulders settling just slightly, as if a long decision had finally reached its end, and the air in the courtroom tightened, every small sound fading into the background, the hum of the lights, the distant shuffle of papers, all of it pulling back to make space for a single moment. And when he spoke, he did not raise his voice, he did not look at the judge, he simply let the words fall into the silence like they had been there all along. "Raven 6, still on station." The words barely rose above a whisper, yet they moved through the courtroom like a pressure wave no one could see, but everyone could feel. And for a fraction of a second nothing happened, no reaction, no sound, just the lingering echo of something that did not belong in a place like this. And then Jason Reed's breath caught mid-inhale, his fingers freezing above the keyboard as if the air itself had turned solid around them, because he knew that phrase. Not from any public record, not from anything taught in law school or clerk training, but from a briefing he had once overheard years ago when he interned at a federal office. A conversation that had stopped the moment he walked too close, a phrase spoken in lower tones, followed by a silence that had carried the same weight now filling this room, and his eyes snapped to Daniel Mercer, really looking at him for the first time, not as an old man in worn clothes, but as something that did not fit the file sitting on the judge's bench, something that had been deliberately left out, and his screen flickered as his system refreshed, the standard database still showing nothing, clean, empty, official, and yet his instincts told him that was the point, that whatever Raven 6 was, it was never meant to be found there. And across the room, Judge Whitmore exhaled slowly, the faintest trace of a smile returning to his face, misreading the silence as confusion rather than recognition. Is that supposed to mean something too? This court, he asked, his tone edged with restrained amusement. Because I assure you, Mr. Mercer, it does not appear in any record I have access to. And a few quiet chuckles followed, uncertain, hesitant, as people looked to each other for confirmation that this was still just an old man grasping at something imaginary. But Jason did not laugh, his chair shifting slightly as he leaned closer to his monitor, his hands moving now, faster than before, bypassing the standard interface, pulling up a secondary access panel he had not touched in years, one that required more than routine clearance. And his heart began to beat harder, not from fear, but from the growing certainty that he was about to step into something far beyond the boundaries of this courtroom. And as he typed the words, carefully, exactly as he had heard them, Raven 6, the cursor blinked once, twice, and then the system did something it had never done before. The screen dimmed for a fraction of a second before a red banner cut across the display, sharp and unmistakable, access restricted, followed by a second line that appeared without prompt, notify command authority, and Jason's throat tightened as he stared at it, because systems did not escalate like that unless something higher had already been listening, and the quiet hum of the courtroom shifted again, subtle but undeniable, as if an invisible line had just been crossed, and Daniel Mercer remained exactly where he was, unmoved, his hand now resting still at his side, his expression unchanged, not waiting, not watching, simply present, like someone who had already done everything required of him. And Judge Whitmore's pen tapped once more against the bench, a little sharper this time. "Clerk," he said, irritation creeping into his voice. "If you are quite finished, we will proceed." But Jason did not respond right away, his eyes still locked on the screen as a new notification blinked into existence. A secure line initializing. A call that did not ask for permission, and somewhere beyond the closed doors of the courtroom, far from the polished wood and orderly rows, something had just been set in motion that no one in this room could stop. The notification did not ring out loud. It did not flash across the entire room. But Jason Reed felt it like a current running through his hands, the secure line pulsing on his screen with a quiet insistence that did not belong in a county courtroom. And for a moment he hesitated, his training telling him to defer, to wait for instruction. But something deeper told him that waiting was no longer an option. So he reached for the receiver built into the terminal, his fingers slightly unsteady as he accepted the connection, and the voice on the other end came through. Immediately, crisp, controlled, carrying a weight that did not need to raise itself to be felt. "Identify the source of the query," it said, not a question, not a request, but a directive. And Jason swallowed before answering, his voice lower than usual. "This is Clerk Jason Reed, Courtroom 3 Bravo. We have an individual who provided a designation, Raven 6, and there was a pause, not long, but long enough to stretch into something significant, as if the words had traveled farther than the wires connecting them, and when the voice returned, it was different, not louder, but sharper, more focused, confirmed the speaker, and Jason's eyes flicked up again to Daniel Mercer, still standing exactly where he had been, unmoved by any of this, as if the room and everything inside it had already faded into the background for him. Elderly male, approximately late 70s, no visible insignia. "Name on record, Daniel Mercer," Jason replied, and another pause followed, heavier this time, like something aligning on the other end, pieces falling into place that had been waiting for a very long time. And then the line shifted, A faint click, and a second voice entered, deeper, carrying authority that did not belong to any local jurisdiction. "This is General Victor Kane." The voice said, calm, measured, unmistakable, and Jason felt his posture straighten instinctively. Even though no one else in the room could hear what was happening, "Repeat the designation," the general continued, and Jason did not hesitate this time. "Raven 6, sir." And the silence that followed was absolute, not empty, but full, like the space before something irreversible. And when General Kane spoke again, there was no doubt left in his tone, only certainty. "Maintain that individual in place. Do not dismiss. Do not escalate. I am en route." And the line went dead just as quickly as it had opened, leaving Jason staring at the screen as the red banner remained, steady and unblinking. And across the room, Judge Whitmore's patience had run thin, his gavel striking once more, sharper, louder, attempting to reclaim control of a room that no longer felt entirely his. "Clerk Reed," he said, his voice cutting through the air, "you will report the status of that system immediately." And Jason turned slowly, the receiver still in his hand, his mind moving faster than his words, because there was no procedure for what had just happened, no protocol for explaining that the chain of command had just reached into this courtroom without warning, and the spectators sensed it too. The subtle shift, the tightening of posture, the way conversations had stopped completely now, replaced by a quiet that felt heavier than before, and Daniel Mercer remained still, his gaze steady, not on the judge, not on the clerk, but somewhere beyond them both, as if he already knew what was coming long before anyone else in the room had even realized something had begun. And outside, down the long hallway lined with flags and polished floors, footsteps echoed, distant at first, then growing closer, measured, deliberate, carrying with them a presence that would not ask for permission when it arrived. The sound of footsteps in the hallway grew clearer, no longer distant, no longer ignorable, each one measured and precise against the polished floor outside. And inside the courtroom, every subtle movement began to slow. Conversations that had not yet stopped faded completely into silence. Even the rustling of paper seemed to hesitate, as if the room itself was listening, and Judge Whitmore felt it before he understood it. A shift in control so slight it could have been dismissed, except it did not go away. It pressed in quietly, steadily, until it settled at the center of everything, and his grip on the gavel tightened just a fraction. "This court will maintain order," he said, his voice firm, louder now, trying to reclaim the space, to reassert the structure he knew. But the words did not carry the same authority they had moments ago, not because they were weaker, but because something else had entered the equation, something that did not answer to the same rules. And Jason Reed stood halfway between his station and the bench, the receiver now lowered, his eyes still fixed on the door, his mind replaying the voice on the line, the name that had not needed explanation, General Victor Kane, and the instruction that had followed, clear, absolute, leaving no room for interpretation. And he realized then that whatever was about to happen had already been decided somewhere far beyond this room. And Daniel Mercer remained exactly where he was, his shoulders relaxed, his breathing even, as if the rising tension around him had no effect at all, his presence unchanged, grounded, the same quiet center in a room that was beginning to shift around him. And a deputy near the side entrance adjusted his stance, instinctively straightening, though no one had given a command, as the footsteps reached the door and stopped, just for a moment, a pause that felt intentional, like the final beat before something irreversible. And then the handle turned, slow, controlled, and the door opened, not with force, not with urgency, but with a quiet certainty that drew every eye in the room. And the figure who stepped inside did not need introduction, not because everyone recognized him, but because of the way the space responded to him. Conversations did not resume, they vanished completely. People did not shift, they stilled, and even Judge Whitmore's voice caught for the briefest second as he watched the man enter, his uniform immaculate, his presence carrying a weight that did not need to be announced. And the deputy nearest the aisle moved first, almost unconsciously, stepping aside, posture straightening into something closer to attention, and one by one, others followed. A ripple that moved through the room without a single spoken order, and Jason felt it again, that same tightening in his chest, but now it came with recognition, because this was not just authority. This was the kind of authority that rewrote the boundaries around it. And General Victor Kane walked forward at an even pace, his gaze steady, not scanning the room, not acknowledging the judge, but moving directly toward the one person who had not moved at all, Daniel Mercer. And as he approached, the distance between them closing step by measured step, the courtroom seemed to contract around that single line, everything else fading to the edges, and Judge Whitmore finally stood, not out of habit, not out of courtesy, but because remaining seated no longer felt like an option, his voice finding its way back, though it carried a trace of uncertainty now. "This is highly irregular," he said, the words formal, controlled, but lacking the certainty they once had. "This is an active proceeding." And General Kane stopped just short of the defense table, his posture straight, his presence absolute, and for a moment he said nothing, his eyes resting on Daniel Mercer with a recognition that did not need confirmation. And in that silence, the balance of the room shifted completely, no longer centered on the bench, no longer defined by the gavel, but anchored instead to the quiet figure who had spoken 2 words that changed everything. General Victor Kane did not look at the judge, did not acknowledge the bench, did not even slow his pace as the weight of the courtroom shifted entirely toward him, because his focus was fixed on Daniel Mercer. And when he finally stopped in front of him, the distance between them no more than a few feet, something unspoken passed in that space, something that did not need rank or record to exist. And for the first time since entering, the general moved, not with force, not with display, but with quiet precision, as his right hand came up in a motion so controlled it almost seemed effortless, and he rendered a salute, clean, exact, held with absolute respect, and the sound that followed was not a gasp, not a reaction, but the absence of everything else, the complete and total silence of a room that had just witnessed something it could not process. And Daniel Mercer did not react immediately, his eyes resting on the general for a brief second longer, as if confirming something that had already been known. And then, slowly, deliberately, he returned the salute, not with stiffness, not with performance, but with a familiarity that spoke of years long buried beneath the surface. And when his hand lowered, the moment did not break. It deepened, settling into the space like something permanent. And behind them, Jason Reed felt his breath release without realizing he had been holding it, his hands now resting against the edge of the desk, no longer searching for answers in a system that had already given him everything it could, because this was the confirmation, not written, not recorded, but undeniable. And Judge Whitmore stood frozen at the bench, the words he had prepared no longer fitting the reality in front of him, his authority, once absolute within these walls, now feeling smaller, narrower, as if it had been placed inside a larger frame without warning. And he cleared his throat, the sound sharper than he intended. "General," he began, forcing his voice back into something resembling control. This court was not informed of any federal involvement in this matter. But even as he spoke, the statement felt incomplete, because it assumed that this situation followed the same rules as everything else he had presided over. And General Kane lowered his hand, his posture unchanged, his gaze finally shifting slightly, not to challenge, not to confront, but simply to acknowledge the presence of the bench. "You were not meant to be informed," he said, his tone even, measured, carrying no hostility, only clarity, and the simplicity of the words carried more weight than any raised voice could have, because they did not argue, they did not negotiate, they stated a boundary that had already been crossed. And a ripple moved through the courtroom again, quieter this time, deeper, as people began to understand that what they were witnessing was not an interruption. It was a correction. And Daniel Mercer remained still, his hands now at his sides, his presence unchanged, as if none of this altered who he was or why he was there. And General Kane turned his attention back to him fully, his voice lowering just slightly, not for secrecy, but out of respect. "Designation confirmed," he said, and there was something in that phrase, something final, something that closed a loop no one else had known existed. And Jason felt it again, that shift. But now it was no longer uncertain, it was defined, and across the room the spectators sat in absolute stillness, no whispers, no movement, because they understood, even without context, that they were no longer watching a man being questioned, they were witnessing a truth being recognized. And Judge Whitmore's hand rested on the edge of the bench, his fingers no longer tapping, no longer signaling control, but holding on to something that had just changed beyond his reach, as the balance of the room settled firmly, undeniably, in a place he could not command. The silence did not break after the salute. It settled deeper, heavier, as if the walls themselves understood that something irreversible had just taken place. And General Victor Kane lowered his hand with the same measured control, his eyes still fixed on Daniel Mercer, not questioning, not confirming anymore, but recognizing, fully and without reservation. And that recognition carried across the room more clearly than any spoken explanation ever could. And for the first time since this moment began, Daniel shifted slightly, not in discomfort, not in reaction, but in acknowledgement. The kind that came from years of understanding exactly what a moment like this meant and exactly how little needed to be said. And behind them, Jason Reed exhaled slowly, his shoulders dropping just a fraction as the tension that had built inside him found a place to settle, because now there was no doubt, no ambiguity left to resolve. The system had responded, the chain of command had answered, and the man standing in front of him was no longer undefined. He was simply undisclosed. And there was a difference that changed everything. And Judge Whitmore felt it most of all. The shift from control to observation, from authority to limitation. His courtroom no longer a contained system, but something intersected by a force he could not regulate. And he straightened, instinctively, his voice returning. Though now it carried a careful edge, one that measured every word before it was spoken. "General Kane," he said, more formal now, less certain. "This court requires clarification." And the request hung there. Not a demand anymore, not quite a question either, but something in between, searching for ground that was no longer stable. And General Kane turned his head just enough to acknowledge the bench again, his posture unchanged, his presence steady. "Clarification has already been provided," he replied. Calm, even, leaving no space for reinterpretation. And the simplicity of the statement landed harder than any explanation could have, because it did not attempt to justify, it did not elaborate. It simply closed the discussion at a level the courtroom could not reach, and a quiet tension moved through the spectators again. Not confusion this time, but realization. The slow understanding that they were witnessing something that operated outside the rules they understood. And Daniel Mercer remained silent, his hands resting naturally at his sides. His gaze no longer distant but present, anchored in the moment without needing to control it, because he never had to. And Jason's eyes flicked once more to his screen, the red banner still there, unchanged, not escalating, not clearing, just holding, as if the system itself had reached its final state and had nothing left to add. And near the side of the room, one of the deputies shifted again, his posture now fully rigid, attention locked forward, mirroring something that had not been commanded but understood. And Judge Whitmore's fingers pressed lightly against the edge of the bench, his mind moving through options that no longer fit, procedures that no longer applied. And for a moment he said nothing, the weight of the situation settling into a space where authority met its boundary. And when he finally spoke again, his voice was lower, more controlled, stripped of the sharpness it once carried. "Mr. Mercer," he said, carefully, "if there is information relevant to this case that this court cannot access, then we are operating without the full context." And it was not an accusation, not anymore, but a statement of limitation. And Daniel looked at him then, fully, his eyes steady, clear, holding no resentment, no triumph, only a quiet certainty that had been there from the beginning. And for a second, the entire room seemed to narrow to that exchange, the judge who had demanded proof, and the man who had never needed to provide it. And the silence that followed was no longer tense. It was defined, shaped by everything that had just been revealed without ever being explained. And somewhere within that silence, the understanding settled into place, not spoken, not written, but undeniable, that some records were never meant to be read, and some names were never meant to be called, except by those who already knew. The room did not return to normal. It settled into something quieter, something more deliberate, as if every person present understood that whatever came next would not follow the patterns they were used to. and General Victor Kane shifted his stance just slightly, not breaking posture, but signaling that the moment of recognition had passed and something else was now required. Something procedural, yet entirely outside the courtroom's control. And when he spoke again, his voice carried the same calm authority, but now it moved with purpose. This individual, he said, his words measured and precise, is operating under a classification that supersedes local jurisdiction. And the phrase landed softly, but its meaning spread through the room with unmistakable weight, because it did not challenge the court. It simply moved beyond it, and Judge Whitmore's expression tightened, not in resistance, but in recalculation, as he absorbed the implications of what had just been stated, his role, still intact, but no longer central, and he nodded once, slowly, acknowledging the boundary even if he did not fully understand it. Then this court will require formal documentation, he replied, his voice controlled, searching for structure within a situation that refused to fit into one, and General Kane's gaze held steady. Documentation exists, he said, but it is not accessible within this environment. And again, there was no confrontation in the statement, only fact, and the courtroom absorbed it in silence, the spectators no longer shifting, no longer whispering, because there was nothing left to interpret, and Daniel Mercer stood at the center of it all, unchanged, his presence neither elevated nor diminished by what had been revealed, as if none of it altered who he had always been. And Jason Reed glanced once more at his screen, the red banner still holding its place, but now accompanied by a secondary line, faint but clear, status locked, and he understood then that there would be no further updates, no additional answers from the system, because the system had already done its part. It had confirmed, escalated, and then stepped back, and near the rear of the courtroom, a quiet shift occurred as two uniformed personnel appeared just inside the doorway, their posture precise, their presence unobtrusive but unmistakable, not entering as enforcement, but as acknowledgement, standing just far enough back to remain outside the immediate proceedings, yet close enough to signal that the chain of command extended even here. And Judge Whitmore exhaled slowly, the sound controlled, his hand resting flat against the bench now, no longer tapping, no longer asserting, but grounding himself in what remained of his authority. "Mr. Mercer," he said, his tone measured, stripped of its earlier sharpness. "Given the circumstances presented, this court will suspend further questioning until appropriate channels can be consulted." And the statement carried through the room with a different kind of weight, not dominance, but acceptance. And for the first time since the proceedings began, the balance of the room felt stable again, not because control had returned, but because it had been redefined. And Daniel inclined his head just slightly, a gesture so small it could have been missed, yet it carried the same quiet finality as everything else he had done. And General Kane gave a single nod in return, not as approval, but as acknowledgement that the correct course had been taken, and the tension that had filled the space did not vanish. It transformed, settling into something quieter, something resolved. And in that stillness, the courtroom understood, without needing explanation, that the man they had watched being questioned was never meant to be explained at all. No one moved right away, not because they were waiting for permission, but because the moment itself demanded stillness, the kind that settles in after something fundamental has shifted and cannot be undone. And Daniel Mercer stood quietly at the defense table, exactly as he had from the beginning, unchanged by the recognition, unchanged by the presence of authority now standing beside him, as if none of it altered the simple fact that he had already lived everything that mattered long before this room had tried to define him. And General Victor Kane remained where he was for a moment longer, his posture steady, his gaze no longer searching or confirming, but resting in quiet acknowledgement. And then, with the same measured precision he had carried into the room, he turned slightly, not away from Daniel, but in alignment with him, a subtle shift that spoke not of command, but of respect shared between two men who did not need to explain themselves to anyone else. And across the courtroom, Judge Whitmore lowered himself slowly back into his chair, the movement controlled, deliberate, his hand resting flat against the bench as if grounding himself in the structure he still held, even as he understood its limits more clearly than ever before. And his voice, when it came, was different now, not weaker, but quieter, stripped of assumption. This session is suspended. Pending federal review, he said, each word placed carefully, not as an assertion of power, but as an acknowledgement of reality. And the gavel came down once more, not sharp this time, not cutting through the room, but settling into it, marking the end of something that had begun long before the first question was asked, and the spectators remained seated for a second longer than expected, as if unsure whether they were allowed to move yet. And then slowly, almost reluctantly, they began to rise, their expressions no longer curious or judgmental, but reflective, carrying with them the quiet understanding that they had witnessed something rare, something that would not be recorded in the same way as everything else that passed through these walls. And Jason Reed stood still at his station, his eyes following Daniel as he stepped back from the table, the faintest shift in his posture signaling that he was ready to leave, not hurried, not burdened, just finished. And as he moved, General Kane fell into step beside him, not leading, not directing, simply accompanying. And the uniformed personnel near the door straightened further as they approached, not speaking, not interrupting, but acknowledging the passage of someone whose presence did not require announcement. And as Daniel reached the doorway, he paused for the briefest moment, not turning fully, just enough for his gaze to pass once more across the room, and for a second, it rested on the bench, on the place where judgment had been handed down without understanding, and there was no resentment there, no correction, just a quiet finality, the kind that did not need to prove anything anymore. And then he stepped through the doorway, the light from the hallway catching briefly on the worn edge of his shirt before he disappeared from view, and the door closed behind him with a soft, measured sound, leaving the courtroom exactly as it had been, and yet entirely different, because the space now held something it had not before, a reminder that not every story could be contained within records. Not every life could be measured by what was written down. And as the last echoes of movement faded and the room returned to its ordinary rhythm, the silence that remained was no longer empty. It carried a truth that would not be spoken aloud, but would not be forgotten, that respect was never something that could be demanded, only recognized, often long after it should have been given.